Everybody, thank you for joining us once again for the Mantle Ministries podcast. Our next guest is from Pearland, Texas, First Church. You've probably seen him. I got his book on your mantle. You've probably heard him preach. He is the host of Morning Devotion with Ken Gurley. And so I don't know if that gave it away, but our next guest is Pastor Ken Gurley. We talk about leadership. We talk about self-leadership, really. We talk about culture, generational transition. We talk about being ready as an Elisha and also being willing to invest as a Elijah. It's everything you'd want from a podcast called The Mantle. I appreciate him coming on. Pray you open your heart and your mind to receive from today's podcast. God bless you. It was a blessing for you to come on. And, we'll kind of get all over the place. We'll talk about Elijah and Elisha. We'll talk about different things. Firstly, let's just get into that. So I try to preface this, right? So
Sure.
Elijah, he calls down fire from heaven, and then he hears the voice of the Lord in a still small voice in a cave. In between, he's depressed. He's saying, Jezebel's going to kill me. Let me die here. And as I often joke, the Lord sends an angel to bring him Chick-fil-A from heaven to make him be sustained for none of that Popeye's chicken sandwich, like the real stuff to get him through those days. Yeah. Yeah. And the Lord he asks a question. Why are you here, Elijah? Why are you here? And he complains, I'm the only one left. And then finally the Lord says, I want you to go anoint several people, but mainly for our purposes, Elisha. And I think that we skip too quickly to the Elijah or the Elisha part of the story, the follower, the mentee, and be faithful, be committed. And we don't give Elijah his due. Then in the midst of all this going on, he takes the time to be sensitive to the Lord and invest in someone's life and put his mantle on the shoulder of a guy out in the field plowing. And so I like to give those voices their due. So who were the voices in your life? Maybe up close, maybe from afar, maybe someone you read in a book, Elijahs, if you will, that impacted you.
Oh, well, thank you, Merrick. This is a great idea and a great concept for this podcast. I will say this, and about the overall Elijah Elisha story, just as you were talking through it, I've been in both positions. I've been the Elijah, I've been the Elisha. And the one thing that, from Elijah's perspective in this story, his ministry had reached its pinnacle at Mount Carmel. That was the pinnacle. He was on the downhill slope. As you mentioned, he was depressed. He was hiding in a cave. The Lord met him there. Basically, you're seeing the conclusion of Elijah's earthly ministry. He is in the final countdown. Now, we're going to see him hundreds of years in the future at the Mount of Transfiguration. But this is his final countdown. And just as John the Baptist introduced Jesus, the Elijah ministry is introducing the Elisha ministry. Mm-hmm. God told him to do those three things you mentioned. Go anoint the king of the Arameans, go anoint King Jehu of Israel, and then anoint Elisha. And it was in that order. Arameans, Israel, Elisha, and he did the third first. In other words, the ministry of Elijah, he recognized, superseded one generation. It had to get into the next generation. And he did the third first, didn't do the other two. It took Elisha 20 years to do the first two anointings.
Wow.
And so Elijah was gone by then. And the sequence, it is curious to me. It's always been curious. But I think what Elijah was saying in that cave, meeting with the Lord, he was done. The earth, wind, and fire, the earth shaking, the Carmel meltdown, that ministry was to be eclipsed by a new ministry. That Elijah's solitary prophet model was to give way to the school of the prophets and the Elisha model. So just a pivotal moment. And I think we race over that. But I've been in the Elisha shoes, and now I'm in the Elijah shoes, and I can more accurately see both. The Elijah voices in my life. Let me just mention two. First was my pastor, James Kilgore. He was the one. I was only in that church a few years. He kicked me out of the church. when I got engaged to my wife to be. Till the day he died, I said, I'm the only guy you kicked out of the church. And but he said, I knew you were needed over there. Tessie was needed over there, a small church. And he was the one, he and his wife, Imogene Kilgore, they saw something in me as a teenager and just fanned the flame of it, put in me a burden for the lost, put in me a burden for missions. Then there was E.L. Holly. I assisted him. He was the district superintendent of Texas District. I assisted him as administrative assistant for a little over 5 years, and he taught me just a great love for the Word of God, precision in the Word of God. And then my mentor in past pulpit ministry just passed, and that was Johnny Harrell. Johnny Harrell was probably the one that guided me in how to develop a message, how to deliver a message. Those were some of the voices, and I'm sure I'm overlooking a dozen more, but those are three prominent Elijah voices in my life.
Yeah. I I think that, and we've had many discussions about Elijah and Elisha's. Some people have seasonal Elijahs, and then it's interesting to see people also that their Elisha's, or Elijah rather, was there's an age gap, but as they begin to grow up in age, they become peers, and that relationship, that dynamic, a little bit of Paul and Barnabas going on. People often forget that Barnabas was the one that stood in the gap for Saul, later referred to as Paul, and then he goes to Tarsus to bring him back. The apostles say, we believe in you now, but then Barnabas has to go grab him. And so that dynamic, there's so many, it is, you can put broad constraints on that relationship, but there's so much movement inside of that, right? There's so many different aspects of how that looks. And it's a very, very powerful thing. I often think about whenever he asked Elijah, I want a double portion of your spirit. I think we miss that. We go to men and we say, I want a portion of this or that. But the spirit was the whole encompassing his character, his prayer life, his integrity. I just don't want to get how someone does a thing. I want to catch their spirit, right? And that mantle represented a heavier burden than I think we often realize.
That is very good. And I would say in my Elijahs, there were things I admired about each one of them that I try to draw from that one person. Brother Kilgore was his spirit. There's no doubt. His compassion for the lost. And that was immense. I mean, he was the one that to preach in Brother Kilgore's church was rare. You never did that as a young preacher. He had 150 pastors out from his ministry.
Wow.
To preach at Life just didn't happen. He didn't really believe in youth service. You didn't preach at youth service. He believed in youth serving, not in youth service. We rarely had youth service. But he would take us down on Friday night in the old downtown Houston, crime-ridden, vice-ridden. We preached our messages on the benches in the square in downtown Houston. Oddly enough, where over a century ago, Charles Parham, William Seymour, Howard Goss, Harvey Scher, DCO Opperman, that is the same square where they all preached. And Brother Kilgore got his start street preaching, and he believed you weren't a preacher unless you could stand on a park bench and get a crowd. And so Friday nights, he was there with us, and we all preached our beginning messages by the dozens on park benches at night in front of drunkards and alcoholics and street people. And he taught us that. That was, then on Saturdays, I was out with Sister Kilgore. She taught us to knock doors. And so we built bus routes on Saturday, ran them on Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon. Brother Kilgore was back with us. This was during the Jesus movement years, and we would be out at what was called Hippie Hill. And Brother Kilgore would teach us a few chords on the guitar and teach us how to sit down, draw a bunch of people smoking weed, doing drugs.
Yeah.
And then he would teach us how to asked them to get on the buses and bring them back to church that evening. And so I learned that from Brother Kilgore. From Brother Holly, it was just pure precision. It was just pure
Mm.
discipline, precision. And then Brother Harold was the art of communication. I think you pick up. Then I did have one more mentor in my life. He happened late in my life. He adopted me. I didn't adopt him. And that was Brother T.F. Tenney. He picked me up and just started pouring in me. In fact, the last week of his life, he called me from his deathbed, and
Mm.
my wife had the presence of mind after hearing me talking to somebody, realizing it's Brother Tenney, to come in and record some of that conversation. He just poured in me, and in that 20-30 minute conversation, he recapped every lesson he had tried to teach me over the last 10 years, just one right
Wow.
after another. And then pretty much that was either his final phone call or one of his last. And I got
Yeah.
word just shortly thereafter he had passed. So we need these mentors. We need the Elijahs in our lives.
Yeah. I think this is a great place to put it. This next question, we referenced the heroes of the faith, and specifically in your life as well. I was reading about when Joshua destroyed Jericho, and he curses Jericho. And later, when I was watching a devotional of yours where you compared 1968 to 2024, I began to see connections. So I'd ask you about it, and you can go as detailed backstory as you want about it. Everything's fair game. So Joshua curses Jericho, and he says, the firstborn is going to be the cost of building the foundation of any man that builds Jericho. And then the youngest will be the cost of any man that establishes gates. Really, the firstborn is going to start it, and the youngest is going to be there, the cost to build it into its fruition. And I was like, what a weird verse, right? And then later, a man named Hiel does this. It cost him the first for the foundation. It cost him his youngest for the establishment of it. And I was praying about it because I talk out loud to God as I begin to read things. I circle him. I ask him. So what's up with the middle generation? Where's the in between? Where's the third, the second or the third? Where's the middle generation? And God began to emphasize it in my mind. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see it repeated. I was like, wait a second. Abraham is the first of this new covenant, okay? And he, in a way, builds the foundation of it, does he not? He's given one child that represents a nation. So he's establishing this covenant. What is faith? What is obedience? Jehovah Jireh is a new concept to his people, to man. He names God that. And then we see him build an altar at a place near Bethel. And Moses is doing a little contextual foreshadowing for the Hebrew, really. He's like, where Jacob, the guy that, Israel, where he built Bethel, Abraham built an altar near there years before in a place near Bethel. And so all of a sudden we skip down to that third generation. Jacob, messed up home, messed up past, liar, deceiver, usurper, sleeping on a rock. Angels are coming in a dream down a ladder, and the Lord says, I'm with you. So he takes the rock, builds a pillar, names it Bethel, the house of God. He wrestles with God, and God says, I'll call you Israel. Many people don't realize this. He's not called Israel until he goes back to where? Bethel. Builds the altar, builds a very similar pillar, anoints an old thing. That will preach right there. Going back and staying committed. He says, now you'll be called Israel. So you've got the first of this covenant, Abraham, and he's defined as a man that built a Bethel for God. You've got the youngest generation of this covenant, and Jacob's defined as a man that built an altar to God. But where's Isaac in all this? And you look at Isaac's life, it's a very photocopy, kind of carrying the torch, just trying to get by. I think he's just trying to uphold what his father Abraham put upon him. And at the end of his life, he's blind, and one son is a deceiver, Jacob. One son is selling his birthright for a bowl of stew. And Hebrews says it's because he was sexually immoral. There's so much going on. His wife's, deceptive. I mean, even at the end, and I know people don't want to hear me, but I'm setting you up for this. Even at the end, he says to Jacob, thinking, not sure who it is. He says, you feel like Esau when I rub your arm, but you don't sound like Esau. So he's torn between what he hears and what he feels with his flesh. And he says, well, make me a meal like Esau. So there's a principle here. He literally lets his perception be governed when what he hears, often the word, faith cometh by hearing, contradicts what he feels, he lets his diet break the tie. So there's a blindness more than just a physical blindness in Isaac's life. Anyways, it hit me right then. The reason why that middle generation is often lost, the first begins to build it, the youngest established it, is I think that Isaac was only defined not by the altars he built like the other men. He was defined by the altar he was put upon. The famous stories put upon the altar. And I was like, why doesn't the middle generation build altars? And I think it's because we've been put on such mighty altars and we're so thankful for them. And we're so overwhelmed by what God gave to our Abrahams. And we have such future tense faith of what God's going to use, in the last days and the next generation. And God's going to do great things. And I think we lose our sense of agency in the now, an Isaac generation, because we're so wrapped up in glorifying what we're been put upon, and we're so wrapped up in faith proclaiming what God's going to do that we forget that we can do something now. And here's where I think it connects to your devotion. We let our context talk us out of taking agency. And we think, well, the heroes of faith, they lived in simpler times. And the heroes of faith, people just, they wanted it more. And that's why we got to wait for a different day. And Azusa Street was just different. They're different people, different men. And as I began to read or listen to your devotion, though 1968 and 2024, technology is so different, right? There's so many different things. But really, when you think about it, our heroes of faith were a lot like us, dealing with very similar plot points and different dynamics. So I think that we're in danger of being an Isaac generation because we don't realize that the Abrahams were a lot like us, and we have something we can add and build in today.
Oh, that's very good. Very good. Some great analogies and great truths there. I think so. The Jews have a saying: everything that happened to Abraham happened to Isaac. That's the
Mm,
Jews' saying from the Old Testament. There was only two times that Isaac was tested. Once, as you mentioned, when he was put on the altar. But I think it's in Genesis 26, and I think this is the chapter, the sole chapter devoted to Isaac in the book of Genesis. The Bible says there was a famine in the land as it was in the days of his father Abraham. So in other words, it's setting us
mm,
up for, again, whatever Abraham did, Isaac did. And that's all you see in Isaac's life until this one moment when he's packing up to go to Egypt, just like his father Abraham did during a previous famine. But God stops him, says, I don't want you to leave. We're going to break the cycle. We're going to break
mm,
it right here. And Isaac obeyed God. And then the remarkable moment of testing was, that's when you read that Isaac did something God did not tell him to do, or at least it's not recorded in Scripture. He actually went out in the midst of a drought and sowed seed, and the
wow.
Lord gave him 100-fold. The Jews believe that Abraham, Israel, Abram's name changed to Abraham, Jacob to Israel, because both of those men failed God.
Mm,
But Isaac, when he was tested twice, he obeyed. And so
mm,
his name never had to be changed. So
wow.
this middle generation, I think, is the link. It's really the stable link between the two generations. It's what gives continuity. It's what brings what's worth of the old into the new. It, it's
Mm,
it's so needed. It's so needed, this middle generation. But I think what we will all see is there is a generation upon whom the ends of the world have come. And of course, that will be the last generation. That will be the Israel generation. Going back to your Elijah, Elisha model, it will be the Elisha generation. Um, and that's why Elijah had to go, is because the John the Baptist ministry was gone. It was to be a Jesus Christ. It was to be an Elisha ministry. And same thing with John the Baptist. That's why he had to go,
yeah.
is he had to decrease where Christ could increase. So this final generation is coming. And my take, and this has really just sort of unnerved me, because I was a kid at the beginning of the Jesus generation. And I was a kid in 1968, but I remember the troubled look on my parents' faces. I remember the sense of dread, because 1968 was when you had a Bobby Kennedy running for president, and now we have a Bobby Kennedy running
Yeah.
for president. So when you had a third party candidate, back then it was George Wallace, now it's Bobby Kennedy. It's when you had protest. Every time the Democratic president would go somewhere, there would be war protests. It was LBJ then, it's Joe Biden now. And it's just eerily similar what's beginning to take place. And what we would never want to happen is what happened in 1968. We began to see the assassinations. Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, and then the assassination attempt following on George Wallace. It was a tumultuous year. Back then, 1968, the Democratic Convention was in Chicago, and it was marked by riots. The Democratic Convention this year will be in Chicago, and they've already said they are going to fill the streets with protests. We are in an unusual day, but at the same time, that was when the Jesus movement began in Southern California.
Yeah.
It was almost as if the Lord said, the chaos in the world needs the healing balm. And that's when the Jesus movement began. That's when we began to see such amazing revival in our churches. What
Yeah.
you saw in Asbury near you
Yeah.
last year happened nonstop. And it was happening not just in Asbury, but everywhere. It was not the senior pastors. It was not even the youth pastors. It was the youth that filled the streets. And while the riots were taking place on one side, they were singing the songs of the Lamb on the other. While they were doing drugs in just immense proportions, the great turn on, tune in, drop out culture of the drug culture of the late 60s, there was this parallel movement of revival that radically changed American Christianity. I believe Gen Z is probably the closest generation to my generation, the baby boomers, that we have seen. They're similar. Yes, the technology is completely different, but the mindset, the willingness to step out and be counted, it's in today's generation. I would say this, Merritt, and this is something else I'm working on you're not aware of, but I'm working with a strategic growth initiative for Brother Bernard, the general board, trying to address an issue that we have, that probably half of our pastors are baby boomers, meaning
Wow.
that we are moving in, and the average age of our pastors is something like 57. We are moving into a unique time. This is the oldest age for senior pastors in America's history. And I mean, when I was a kid, you're a youth secretary. When I
Yeah.
was your age, I was youth president. We had 16 on our committee, all 36 and under. 12 of the 16 were full-time pastors. 2 were full-time evangelists. 1 was a full-time youth pastor, and the other was an administrator at a church. And the crazy thing about it is then that each section we had 10 to choose from. that could
Wow.
have fulfilled that same quality. We don't see that anymore. And this is
Right.
why what you're doing, Merritt, and I can't underscore it enough how important it is. This next generation is not just important in the future, it's important now. And this generation has got to be equipped, empowered, affirmed, called to step forward because the age demands it, the world demands it, the apostolic church requires it, or we're going to see churches begin to just fall off the map because their successor is not yet out there. So that's
Do
a
you
lot to unpack, but it's just what's on
no,
my heart.
yeah. No, that's do you think I mean I remember like my dad's pastoring at 21.
Yes.
Uh you know, Brother Hurst.
Hmm.
So and you saw it, a full-time evangelist, 18, 19, sometimes 17 and now it seems more and more outlandish to modern ears. Do you think it's two things meeting in the middle? I know our society has developed a very strong mistrust. I feel like the teenage years, first in the early 1900s, the idea of teenage years begins to be developed. Before you were working on the farm, you were committed, but that's been pushed back further and further. People were getting married later and later for good and uh, different reasons, good and bad reasons. It does feel like I'm leaving my 20s, right? I
Hmm.
feel like the expectation now, not me personally. My church is very open, but I feel like from a cultural aspect, I feel like the 20s are the new late teens. I feel like, and I think it's a combination of two things. I think the younger generation have made mistakes, and that makes the old generation cautious, and that's true. But there, you can counterbalance, baby with the bathwater, right? And I do feel too like it's a combination of that plus the enemy. Gideon's son was going to go take out the leader of the enemy they fought. The lanterns, and they begin to kill themselves and in fear they run off. People forget they fight afterwards. And Gideon's son is cornered the main honcho, if you will, and he goes to take him out. And the enemy begins to talk at Gideon because his son hesitates. And he says, "You're going to let this boy kill me? You can't do it yourself." So he appeals to the insecurities of the son and he attacks the insecurities of the father and says, "You can't do this? Are you too old? Like, what's going on?" And so he takes the sword and he kills the enemy. So I think that's the work of the enemy, to make the younger insecure and make the older insecure. And so we just don't connect. I think that mantle sometimes, like in the Elijah story, it drops and picks up. But some people's mantles have to be grabbed simultaneously by both parties and have faith in each other, right? That, listen, we're not going to be talked out of this. I believe in you, you believe in me, and we can transition this thing together.
Oh, that's excellent. And I think you're right. I think there are generational issues, and I if I was to talk to senior pastors my age, and this is what I've heard, and I'll just share with you what I've heard.
Mhm.
Um, A, they expect to live longer, and they they want to serve longer. And in their minds, they think the only way they can continue to serve is to continue to be the lead pastor. Okay, now the baby boomer generation has been conditioned to believe that if you're not in charge, you're not valued. Okay, so
Mm.
that's part of it. Yes, to your point, um, we have watched we have watched people that we've trusted in next generation rise up, try to take churches the wrong direction, fall by the wayside. But really, hasn't that been true in every generation? That's
Right.
nothing unique to one generation. But there are some people that are gun shy. Um, then to the next generations, I would say you're correct, absolutely correct. I mean, there's many studies to document this, that today's 20s are equivalent to my generation's teens. Okay,
Hmm.
now that's um, why that is. I don't know. I mean, I smarter people than I would have to figure that out, but it is true. I mean, we were working Our parents made sure we had jobs when we were 13, 14 years old. I mean, I was sacking
Right.
groceries. It was just a different mindset back then. And so and I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying, it's child labor laws.
Yeah.
And, but, but I do think, but here's what I would say. I would say this: the glory of young men is their strength. And those who learn to plow in their youth are so much more expedited and accelerated than those who enter into the ministry later.
Mhm.
I think we're missing the boat because here's what happens. Let's say a teenager feels a call of God, but then they said, well, I'm going to get my education. I'm going to get a career and a vocation because if I'm going to start a church, I'm going to need a job. And I've watched the prior generations. They didn't prepare. They don't have anything. They hit retirement years with nothing. And I'm not going to make
Yeah.
that mistake again. So there's a lot of observations going on. And I'm going to get my career. I'm going to get my vocation, get my education, get married, have my 2.7 children, find my 2,400 square foot home, and get a 401k plan started, get an IRA, and the greatest enemy of ministry appears, and that's
Hmm.
time. Time just keeps the months roll by, the years roll by, and the longer people put off diving into ministry, the greater the likelihood they never will. And
Right.
I think that's where we're at, Mary, is we've this next generation has seen all of the red flags from the previous generation of what not to do, and they're
Yeah.
self-correcting, and I admire that. Yet in their self-correction, time is slipping by,
Right.
and as the time slips by, these baby boomer pastors who are now 59 to 72 years old, these baby boomer pastors are getting older and older. And churches that are pastored by baby boomers are filled with baby boomers. And the church themselves are getting older,
Yeah.
and they they don't accept a young pastor. And it's just we've got a perfect storm brewing right here.
Right.
And it has to be addressed right now. Right now, we need 3,000 Gen Z ministers, at least 3,000. 5,000 would be optimal. And
Yeah.
I know they're out there, Merritt. I know they're out there. I mean, look at Youth Congress. I
Yeah.
know they're out there, but I think somehow we have to intersect them. Sure, go to college, but do you have a preaching point? Sure, go
Hmm.
to college, but are you leading a small group? Are you teaching Bible
Yeah.
studies? Are you working in your local church? Are you doing your ministry? In other words, it's not an either or. There can be parallel tracks here.
Yeah. And then yeah, the danger is it becomes something you start in when you're 38 or you're 40. Yeah, the time and the trust and everything on. I was at talking to my father about this. Just that it does seem like, Jesus started his ministry at 30, and I don't think people would have accepted him now if he walked up. We'd have made him sit in hyphen a little bit longer. And that's not true everywhere, but it is as far as demographically, it's like, wait a second. The 30 is the new, 22 or 23. I was on the phone setting up my internet recently for my house, and the guy on the phone was a year younger than me. He said, "How old are you?" So he knew I got a new house, and he heard two kids screaming in the background. I said, I'm 28, and he was 27. He said, you have a house and kids? I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean I have a house and kids? But the paradigm shifted. I know
Yes.
economy and all, but
Mm-hmm.
still, it's expectation. It's the hunger and the drive to just create and go out there and explore. I think of it like everything in life as a garden, another garden of Eden. I'm in my garden with my Eve, and we're trying to create and tend and show God's, his glory and his intention in every aspect of our lives. I can't wait until I'm 32, 34.
Oh, that's would you be an anomaly though? And I think in today's culture, Merritt, you're an anomaly, and
Yeah.
anyone viewing this podcast or listening to it, they would be an anomaly if they were in that situation. Um, but I I do think, and this is, I think we've been cursed. And let me just borrow from the Elijah Elisha model here. Okay, let's talk about this. When I accepted my call into full time ministry, I tried to burn my plow. Okay,
Hmm.
my plow was my CPA work. Now, I learned that is a plow that just absolutely refuses to burn. I mean, I have used that, you know, but I think in our calling, we've set up a scenario that so filters and limits true God called people, as you mentioned a moment ago, people who feel like they're not there yet, that
Yeah.
they've not arrived, that they've got flaws in their lives. And I mean, just study the 12 apostles and you see basket loads of syndromes and
Yeah.
issues. But we set up the call of God that unless you are ready and will physically walk away from everything, then you're not called.
Hmm.
I think that's, I think that is an idealistic, if not romantic, view of the ministry. The reality is, you find Peter and John still fishing late into their ministry. They paid the taxes
Right.
with the fish they caught, and I I think what's happening is we are saying until you are ready to give up everything, you can't be used of God.
Right.
And I think we've missed it. I think the willingness to be there, to give up everything, is what we should focus on.
Right.
And then permit people as they're going through high school. And I think if we even wait till college, we're nearly too late.
Hmm.
As they're going through high school, form one of these P7 clubs, form a Bible club, do a pray around the pole, or gather at the pole, or form Bible studies, do groups, teach them to invite everybody. Um, of course, then we have a lot of homeschool children now in our movement. That wasn't true when I was a kid. We
Yeah.
all went to public school, and we we were taught you invite everybody in your class to church, and
Right.
so the dynamics were different. But I think even with the parameters that we're working with now, it can still be the same in the sense of raising people into ministry sooner and getting them involved in ministry no matter what phase and season of their life they're in, education preparation, such that we will start seeing 21-year-old pastors again because
Hmm.
they're needed. They're needed desperately.
Yeah.
Um, I think this is the day that the alarm bell needs to sound. I mean, it's really getting to an urgent level.
Yeah. I think I try to tell my youth in hyphen, if you ever find a contradiction you feel like is in scripture, you just need greater context, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so if I have an idea, a principle from scripture that I take from one story, and if it doesn't stretch into all the other stories, then maybe my idea is a little misguided, or it
Very
needs
good.
texture, it needs angles, it needs nuance. And for some, right, as you're saying, some the plows are burned completely. But then we cut ourselves out, we graft ourselves out of the story. Like poor Paul. Paul did not fit that formula. I mean, he gave up the killing of people, sure. He gave up the
Yeah.
terrorism,
Yes.
but he's still making tents. And like, I wonder if Paul struggled with that. He's human, If so, well, Elisha burned his plow. Paul, why don't you trust in the Lord as you're making a tent? It's like, wait, we can have an Elisha and a Paul. I mean, my goodness, they both can operate. Uh, so there's nuance. There's angles to this
Yeah.
tapestry of how God moves in our lives.
Oh, that's very good. And Paul is a great case in point. The tent making. That's That's pretty, how humbling. But
Yeah.
how connected it kept him. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it kept him connected to life. And I think that's important. And on our church staff, I didn't start this. It's always been this way in our church. Um, Everyone on staff has another job. In other words, we're all doing another job
Mm-hmm.
because the church can never pay what people are really worth. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what we all do is we work second jobs to provide the benefits and the extras that we need to get by. Ideally, if we're able to do that from the church office, and most do, most have
Yeah.
their second jobs, and we're all in the church office together working. We're doing we're doing one job that makes the money, and we're
Yeah.
doing another job that brings fulfillment.
Yeah.
And 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 so I think, but what we've noticed is how many times those secular, what we would say secular jobs, converge with the sacred. That
Mm-hmm.
the connections we formed with these other positions are constantly flowing in and out of our ministry. And what we
Mm-hmm.
learn, what we do, the talents, the abilities, the skills, they're always converging with ministry. So I would say we need to abolish that old secular sacred split, that that is the world, this is the church. And if you work in the church, then you cannot work in the world. Well,
Mm-hmm.
that's, you're just not going to find that in Scripture. That is our own creation. And how much how much it's needed right now for people to
Yeah.
just go out and live the Christian life in front of others. And in ministry, it's the ticket, it's probably the pass, it's the open door for every younger minister to have an open venue wherever they go, is to say, I can create a ministry anywhere. And
Yeah.
it's that creation that will start lowering the age of our pastors, our lead pastors, because they will start stepping into roles in churches.
Yeah. I think it's a perfect time to kind of segue into this. I was thinking about praying about really what is a mantle, right? And we could talk about it all day. The mantle's put upon Elisha, and we already referenced double portion of your spirit. And it's not just what he picked up; it's a symbol of what he picked up years of walking with Elijah. I'm sure around the campfire, he saw the full humanity of him. He saw the ins and the outs, and so he's picking up things. He's picking up his spirit. And I think we confuse sometimes the obligation of a thing and the spirit of a thing. And so I think we put the obligation of ministry upon people very quickly, but we think we put a mantle. We haven't. The mantle is the spirit to accomplish it. He's in covenant. The mantle represents I'm in covenant with God and my fellow man. I think sometimes we give people a yoke that makes them a covenant to us, service, utility for us in our church, but we haven't helped them build the infrastructure to be in covenant with God. And eventually, we can talk about prayer if we have time, because that's one of the main mechanisms by which we honor that aspect. But you mentioned many times about what your church went through with Hurricane Ike, and you had to rebuild infrastructure and you had to rebuild a culture. And as I began to hear the story, I was really moved by the idea that you can sense as your leadership gets up and speaks, different generations are speaking. You get the sense that if you just passed out obligation, this boat would not have floated. But people began to catch a vision, the spirit behind it, the I'm in covenant with the God and the boat that I'm building. I'm not just Noah's kids could have resented him, but they forgot the God that we're building this for. So what did that look like when you went through that? And how did you get, what were the prayer maybe or the principles that you got through where I just don't want to rebuild the building. I want to build a people that's going to be in this building. And I think you've accomplished it. How did that go?
Oh, that's very good. I would say the storm that destroyed our building, Hurricane Ike, it happened in the fall of '08. Um, the church we were up until then is not the church that came out of the storm. The people changed. We literally had just a turnover in the congregation. And so the way it happened, the storm hit, and then that was on a Friday night, Saturday morning. Monday morning, Lehman Brothers in New York City went under, and the financial collapse of the fall of '08 took place.
Mm-hmm.
There was no money to be had. You couldn't borrow money. Our insurance company was overexposed in the Gulf Coast area. It took us 7.5 years to get the claim satisfied. It was not satisfied really to what should have been done. Finally, we just had to get an agreement to at least get some money. The building didn't look that bad, and yet it had allowed that stormwater in. Stormwater's contaminated with all sorts of tropical things. So molds, black molds, penicillin bacteria, all sorts of tropical things just began to grow in the building. No power for 18 days. And so it just became an incubator, a petri dish for contaminants. So even if we could have repaired the structure, spent $1 million or $2 million and repaired the structure, the interior was gone. So all soft surfaces had to be removed. The insurance agent first came out and he said, "You're going to have to take it to the steel and stone." And Merritt, I heard the voice of the Lord telling me that was more than just physical infrastructure. I had to get the church itself spiritually back to the steel and stone. For us, that became not doctrine. The doctrine was there. Doctrine hasn't changed before or after the storm. What had to change was a culture, the culture within the church. That before Ike, everybody had their jobs, everybody had job descriptions, the infrastructure was there, people were knocking it out of the park. It was an event-driven church. Throw us an event. We love events. We could do events. It was not a purpose-driven church. It was not a process, system-driven church. We had to change the culture. For us, the culture changed with one word. And I was preaching up in the Northeast, pulled over in a Dunkin' Donuts about a mile from Plymouth, Massachusetts, and raining, cold. I was upset. The church had gone down nearly to nothing because there's 250 UPC churches in Houston Metro. We had no building. We had no place to worship. We finally found one, but it had no heat, no air conditioning, and we had no ministries. We had nothing to offer, just nothing to offer. And people began to leave. The smart ones all left. That's what we said. The smart ones left. And so the Lord spoke to me and dropped a word in my heart. And that word was others, 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 others. That we were going to rebuild on others. And by the way, I found out, I didn't realize 400 years ago, a mile from where I was sitting in that Dunkin' Donuts parking lot, the very first sermon preached in America, the year after that winter had destroyed half of the Mayflower occupants, it was Philippians 2. Don't think about yourself, think about others. Don't think about the graveyards. Don't think about what could have been, might have been, should have been. Think about others. That was the first message preached by Samuel Chapman. And I was a mile from that when that word is like a 400-year-old word from the Lord just dropped in my spirit. Came home, I was so excited, called my son-in-law on the phone that day from that parking lot, said, "God's told me what we're going to do. We're going to focus on others, others, others. Just forget about everything. Focus on others." We eventually got back in the building. We built risers and balconies when everyone would have fit in the ladies' bathroom in our church. We sacrificed. We sold things. We did everything we could do to create space. and we cut silhouettes out, hundreds and hundreds of silhouettes of people, and sat them on empty pews, and said, these are the others. We don't know their names, but they'll come. And it took years, but every one of those silhouettes eventually disappeared. And the ministry mindset of people, not just credentialed ministry, not those called to preach, but the entire church family became an outward focused. And in that outward focus, healing came to our church. We've had several times in the last 15 years that we've had to hit the reset button. But every time we hit the reset button is to get back to others, and we start afresh and start anew. And it's developed a group of ministers that are just pretty outstanding in the way they look at things. They have a servant's heart, and they're reaching for others. And it's reflected now in our church. Our church reflects the community. The average age of the community is 29. Average age of our church is 26. It's the most multicultural community in Texas, and our church reflects that now. And it's because of an outward vision.
I remember Sister Whaley speaking about how a second storm hit. Was it Harvey that hit recently?
Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah, and she compared the two storms, and how in the second storm, small group members were reaching out to their other small group members, and they were used to rescue people that were stranded on top of the roof of their homes. And I was like, man, that was, I mean, such a powerful thing. Just that, I mean, sometimes churches, they're poor pastors, pastoral care person. Okay, that poor person, they just can't keep up all people in the hospital, all the things going on. And so when the saints take ownership to reach out and know what's going on and know the ups and the downs, it's such a powerful thing it was so expressed in that heightened moment, such a natural disaster. I think that was just a phenomenal thing. And I got that sense that that's just not something you feel when you walk in the building. That's not just a mantle that you see in a distance. You people begin to wear that.
So that's what I would say. And yes, there was a tale of two storms and a tale of two completely different churches in a period of 9 years. The radical change that had happened. Didn't have to tell everybody. When they got to the building, they started driving to the church, and they started realizing we had lights. They turned every light on the parking lot, every light in the building on, started unlocking doors. Nobody told them to do this. They opened the refrigerators to see what food we had. They started cooking. The first responders started showing up, saw lights on. We started feeding first responders. They started bringing the refugees. The boats started going out from our church. And it was all small group driven. So for 13 days straight, day and night, we were cooking and distributing food. And over $7 million of food was given away from our church in those 13 days. Because people found out we were doing it. Truckloads of food just started showing up. Restaurants started bringing their food for us to cook. And it was a radical change. I would say this about the mantle, because I think this is, I believe the mantle, and in a sense, we understand the Elisha story because it was so prophetic. It was John the Baptist giving way to Jesus Christ. There had to be hard closures between the two ministries. Okay, it was like there had to be hard closures because it was prototypical of the ministry that comes, because Elijah would come in the last days, and Jesus said they didn't recognize their Elijah and John the Baptist. And I think now, and we see this in the ministry of Paul, I think the mantle is not a moment. It's not a moment when the elder is passing from the scene and the younger is to take over. It's not a Moses-Joshua situation. Moses is going to go up to Nebo and Joshua, and it's not that moment now. The moment is always that every day that mantle is being transmitted. As you said, that spirit is being transmitted. The Apostle Paul, when you read his letters, he affirmed, he empowered, sent Titus to Crete, sent Timothy to Ephesus, sent Silas here. He's empowering and affirming and literally enduing them and cloaking them with the authority to act. Because he had his ministry, his mission, he was the apostle to the Gentiles. He couldn't do it by himself. The
Right.
mission was too big, and it was too important to wait until he died to pass the mantle. The mantle had to be passed constantly and to as many people as possible. I don't think we need to get zealous or jealous of anyone's mantle. I believe there's plenty to go around. I believe Brother Kilgore's mantle rests on 150 different pastors and many thousands of more people. In other words, it's not there's just one mantle to be given. I would just urge and underscore, embolden, highlight the fact that mantles are falling each and every day. And
Right.
there's authority being passed and there's affirmation coming to just step into that and realize that this is not a point in time. This is a process, that the mantle is being passed.
Right. I mean, even the people, Philemon, Philemon, whatever they want to, however, I don't want to offend anybody. The whole book is written for others. He's reaching out he's
Yes,
reaching for someone. And the language he uses, I know the word imitate, so tainted by modern society, to copy or to be fake. But Paul uses it all the time: imitate me as I imitate Christ. So a mantle, as you were saying, it's like personified culture. It's like self-governance that you take upon yourself. I mean, the idea of being disciplined or being a disciple is that you accept the discipline of the person or the ideal that you're looking up to. You're falling in step. So I can't not want the man or the woman that I respect and want their mantle. I have to
right.
fall in step with the culture they're dealing with. I think that's beautiful for sure. You've been very gracious with your time today. I know. Life's moving fast for everybody, so I very grateful today that you joined us. Any final goodbyes? Anything I can leave with everybody before we cut everybody off out there in Radio Land?
Let me just say thank you, Merritt, for this opportunity to do this. I believe that this generation that is rising right now, hasten. It needs to be expedited. There needs to be a catalyst to move it forward quicker. I sense a hastening in the spirit, and we are living in the days of acceleration. So step forward. Don't be bashful. Warts and all, issues and all, idiosyncrasies, hang-ups, bring them with you. You'll sort them out in ministry. You'll get it all figured out. But don't wait till that perfect day to dive in to what God's called you to do. Do it now. Do it with all of your heart.
Amen. I think it's a perfect place to close the day. Everybody, thank you for joining us once again for the Mantle Ministries podcast. We'll see you next time. God bless.
Thank you for joining us today for the Mantle Podcast, presented by Mantle Ministries and the Kentucky District UPCI.